Clerk will report House Resolution H.R. 274.
House Resolution number 274, patroned by Delegate Ayala, amending and readopting Rule 38 of the Rules of the House of Delegates pertaining to an immediate consideration of a Senate joint resolution ratifying amendment to the United States Constitution. Mr. Speaker, the resolution has been distributed. It's available online, and it is before the body.
Delegate from Prince William, Doug Ayala.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to the resolution.
Delegate has the floor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a hard act to follow, the delegate from Prince William that sits beside me. All I want to say is today is a historical moment, and I look to my brothers and sisters on the floor and say, let's do the right thing. You don't have to agree with me, but equality is about constitutional, fair representation. You don't have to like what I say, and that's okay. But today, we are voting on the principles that will shape our Constitution. In the words of Shirley Chisholm, that she spoke on the ERA, August 10th, 1970, and she said, this vote will provide a legal basis for attack on the most subtle, most persuasive, and most institutionalized form of prejudice that exists. Today, there is a reason for optimism that will start to die with the present older generation. It's time that we act to ensure full equality of opportunity to those citizens, although in the majority, suffer the restrictions that are commonly imposed on the minorities, to women. I thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for your vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Shenandoah, Delegate Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the measure.
Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, likewise, I would like to frame my remarks in terms of the consequences or potential consequences of this proposed rule change. Mr. Speaker, I had what I thought was a great moment of civil disagreement with some of the advocates on this particular piece of legislation from my district. I visited with them in my office this session. I expressed to them my very legitimate, well-founded concerns about the impact of this legislation, whether intended or unintended, foreseen or unforeseen. I believe that my concerns were and remain well-grounded in fact and law and history, even recent history, which I will address in a moment. We had a civil discussion, so civil that it was proposed that in the coming weeks and months we could have continue to have civil discussions, those of us who find ourselves in different sides of the political spectrum. And I would have greatly encouraged that. Since that time, Mr. Speaker, I have been called the worst names by those same folks. I have been accused of the most outrageous motivation in opposing this particular piece of legislation. And that didn't just happen in that context. It's also happened right here on this floor. We've been accused of trying to silence people, trying to oppress people, trying to make other people into second-class citizens. If that's not fear-mongering, I don't know what is. Certainly we're not doing that, Mr. Speaker. And the other side of the aisle knows full well that there are legitimate concerns about what could occur upon the passage of this amendment. The delegate from Prince William just mentioned how somehow this amendment would aid in protecting women in domestic violence situations. When she gave her speech earlier this session on the floor, she specifically referenced the Federal Violence Against Women Act. By its very nature, the Violence Against Women Act would be unconstitutional under what we're about to do. Women-owned businesses in Virginia, an effort to raise up, protect, support women in this Commonwealth, and there are federal examples of this as well, would be unconstitutional. That designation for procurement would be unconstitutional. Federal and state programs all around the country that are designed specifically to support inner-city boys and inner-city girls in their public schools would be unconstitutional. And going back to what was the elephant in the room until we started talking about it on Monday, and somebody finally decided to respond to it, Mr. Speaker, in several states, this amendment language, when adopted in those state constitutions, has resulted in the very strict scrutiny that advocates want, and they want it applied in situations relating to an unfettered right to an abortion right up until the moment of birth and at taxpayer expense. And the record is clear about that, despite the several hours of legal research that was done by one of our colleagues. And it didn't happen in the 70s that these examples occurred. Last Friday, the Alaska Supreme Court used their ERA language in their state constitution that says because of sex, and they said that the state can't even limit taxpayer funding for abortion under their state law through Medicaid. Can't limit it at all, because you can't single out abortions as different from other, quote, elective procedures and treat pregnant women differently. Now, guess who knows that that is really what is a major component of this language, the language that's been adopted in about 13 states, I believe. The pro-abortion lobby, the advocates, know it very well, because it's Planned Parenthood who is suing under these state laws and these state constitutions. It's NARAL that's suing under these state laws and constitutions. Mr. Speaker, this session, America was horrified about legislation being put forth by the other side of the aisle, by the Democratic Party, that a majority of them either co-sponsored or voted for in this very House, that would have allowed you to very easily request an abortion right up until the moment of birth in the Commonwealth of Virginia, without any requirement that there be any problem whatsoever. A whiff of a mental health problem,
Mr. Speaker,
would have resulted, Mr. Speaker, in that outcome.
Point of order. Mr. Speaker,
Fairfax, August.
I've tried to be patient and deferential here, but it appears to me that the gentleman speaking to the ERA amendment, what actually is before us, is a rules change that would allow for immediate consideration of a constitutional amendment. And so I think we're getting a little bit of field of the
I think the delegate framed his opening remarks in that context, and I would say the delegate from Prince Williams probably didn't frame her remarks at all in that context. Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, if anyone thinks or says this has nothing to do about abortion and nothing to do about the unfettered right to it right up until the moment of birth and nothing about taxpayer funding of it, they are either uninformed or misguided or being much less than honest about what they're saying. Because guess who thinks it? All the people who are suing, using that language to make that very point and being successful in court all over the country, doing just that. So to accuse us of, those of us who have legitimate concerns about this, of being merely out to oppress people, to treat them as second-class citizens because we value the sanctity of life, among all these other reasons, is absurd, and it's unfortunate. And if we're ever going to have that civil debate that my constituents requested of me, we have to appreciate where everybody's coming from and not call each other names and not misconstrue our motivations and not accuse each other of doing terrible things to one another just because we're not getting our way, because we refuse to acknowledge either what something does that we hadn't thought of, or we refuse to do something that we absolutely know it does to advance it. This rules change is not about the ERA, though. It is about how we conduct our business in this body, how we have for 400 years, the precedent, the protocol, the procedure of this House. And I have never seen or heard of anybody making a specific rule change to advance a specific piece of legislation embodied in that rule change. I've never heard of that. And there is no bottom to that, Mr. Speaker. There is no end to that, where that can go, if that is the way the other side of the aisle wants to play that. There's no end to it. How do we conduct our business if that is the way we're going to do things, simply because, oh, I have this other thing I'd like to put in the rules now, and we'd have it immediately considered by everybody? That's not the way we do business, Mr. Speaker. And I would urge the body to defeat this rule change.
Delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Simon.
Mr. Speaker, speaking of the resolution.
The delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, I want to speak specifically to the rules change itself and be clear about what this is. It's interesting that the conversation's gone where it has, because this is likely our opportunity to vote here on the floor about whether or not we want to give folks an opportunity to vote on a very popular resolution that came out of the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support, and whether we'll have a chance to actually cast that vote and indicate our preference on that. No, I've never heard of anybody doing it quite this way either. And I've done a lot of research. I spent a lot of my weekend going back, through manuals of the House and Senate, for about 100 years, trying to figure out where these rules come from and how they've gotten to be the way they are. And as I said yesterday in my remarks, the problem we've got here is that the rules have always been intended to give voice to a majority of the body and to allow the body to take votes when necessary, when the leadership of the majority party wouldn't let things come forward. And we have a discharge rule that allows us to do that, and it applies to bills. And I've got a rules change coming up later that I think corrects what was a technical error. But the reason that this rules change was crafted the way it was is because of the debate we just heard between the gentlewoman from Prince William and the delegate from Shenandoah. This is likely your opportunity to vote on whether you think the ERA should be ratified by the people of Virginia or not. And so make no mistake, when you cast this vote, that is exactly how we're going to explain it to the folks back home on what this vote means. And so I hope it'll be the pleasure of the body to vote yes to this resolution so that a motion later in the morning hour will be in order to bring a Senate joint resolution forward so that once and for all we can let the people of Virginia know where we stand on the ERA. If you don't like it, if you share the gentleman from Shenandoah's opinion of it, get it to the floor and vote no. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Shall the resolution be agreed to? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 50, noes 50.
Ayes 50, noes 50. The resolution is defeated.